Hello, thanks for joining me in this video. This is victory for Biafrans. This is victory for the lovers of justice and the entire humanity. Mazi Nnamdi Kanu defeats Kenya's authority and the Nigerian government over the breach of his fundamental rights and adoption and subsequent subjection to inhuman abuse of his fundamental privileges within the Kenyan territory, being a legal immigrants to Kenya. It is quite unfortunate that the Kenyan authorities, government could deny knowledge of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu adoption within the Kenyan territory. In fact, at the international airport in Kenya, and his subsequent rendition back to Nigeria. What does that tell? What does that imply? That there is no security in Kenya, and the life of immigrants could no longer be guaranteed. The security of immigrants could no longer be guaranteed in the Kenyan territory. You can imagine an immigrant with British passports lawfully entered Kenya and was abducted after being tortured for 8 years, denied foods and medications, being bullied, battered, and renditioned back to Nigeria. And yet Kenya denies involvement. It is quite unfortunate, but justice has been served at the Kenyan High Courts, indicting the involvement of Kenya in this unfortunate and disastrous engagement. It is a gross violation of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu's fundamental right of movement by awarding 120 million naira in favor of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu as a way of compensation. But beyond that, what is the significance of this ruling? Yes, the Kenyan government has put up robust defense, but you can't establish your innocency on illegality. So denying involvement rather implicates you and exposes your weakness as a government, that the primary essence of governance has been defeated, that the security of any national going to Kenya cannot be guaranteed under these circumstances. It is quite unfortunate, and that has brought a very bad public image as far as Kenya is concerned. Well, justice has been served as Professor Mulumba leads the Defense Counsel to Mazi Nnamdi Kanu. And finally, victory has been determined. What does that imply? That the IPOB as a movement is a law-abiding organization, and an organization that operates based on the rule of law. That is another nod, of course, to the pursuit and the quest for the restoration of the Biafran state. It is an affirmation for the Mazi Nnamdi Kanu quest for Biafra restoration. And let's just have a review of the determination by the court of Kenya. This is an excerpt from that ruling. It is quite an interesting development. Now, that already has indicted the Nigerian government. There is no need, under any circumstances, under any law, for Mazi Nnamdi Kanu to have been subjected to any further trial, because Nigeria has illegally breached his fundamental right in the first instance and cannot be a beneficiary of the same illegality It is quite unfortunate. That is a blunder that is compounding the already worsened situation. After 5 years of rigorous legal battle, here comes the ruling. Okay, let's read. A high court in Nairobi, Kenya, has ruled that the adoption and rendition of the indigenous people of Biafra's leader, Mazi Nnamdi Kanu, in Kenya, and his subsequent rendition to Nigeria in June 2021 were unlawful and illegal. Unlawful and illegal. Wow, that is quite interesting. Of course, congratulations to Mazi Nnamdi Kanu and the indigenous people of Biafra having been vindicated once again, that their stance is being protected by the law. The right to self-defense, to self-determination is enshrined in international laws, and being that Kenya and Nigeria are signatory by ratification, they are under law to adhere to those and uphold the fundamental rights of humans and people. It is quite interesting. Delivering the judgment, Justice E.C. went ahead that the action of both the Kenyan and Nigerian governments amounts to gross violation of Kanu's fundamental human rights as protected by their respective constitution. By their respective constitution, even the constitution of Nigeria and that of Kenya recognizes to uphold the fundamental right of individuals, which Mazi Nnamdi Kanu is not an exemption. It is quite interesting. The court also awarded Kanu 10 million Kenyan shillings, okay, in a compensatory damages against Kenyan governments for his role in the unlawful adoption and rendition, QED, incriminating and indicting Kenya governments is one of the laudable victory for Mazi Nnamdi Kanu. Yes, judgment has been served from the territory where such atrocity was, where such wickedness was perpetrated. That is quite interesting. So it stands now that the Kenyan government is guilty of the unlawful adoption and subsequent rendition of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu to Nigeria. So they are both accomplices to this crime. It is quite interesting, honestly. That is wonderful. That is wonderful. And that is a great news for the Biafrans. It is a win-win for Biafrans. You see, sometimes it is now clear that, for me, I believe the Nigerian government must have been regretting their actions by now, because it has backfired in such a way that it has dented the reputation of Nigeria in international community, including Kenya involvement in this. So Kenya will not recover from this negative impact the extraordinary rendition of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu and this adoption has cost them. So international community now will consider Kenya as not being safe for immigrants. That is just the case, and they have to pay dearly for that. Not just awarding 10 million Kenyan shillings. It doesn't make, but the impact it has created the perception about the commitment of Kenya to defense of fundamental human rights is very abysmal. It's quite unfortunate. Delivering judgment, Justice E.C. Nwita held that the actions of both the Kenya and Nigerian government amounted to gross violation of Kanu's fundamental human rights as protected by their respective constitution. Justice E.C. Nwita said, having considered the pleading and arguments by parties, the decision relies on the Constitution and the law. I came to the following conclusions. First, the government of Kenya violated the Constitution and Mr. Nnamdi Kanu's rights and fundamental freedom. Having entered Kenya lawfully, he was subject to the protection offered by the Constitution of Kenya 2010, and the government of Kenya had an obligation to uphold and protect his rights and fundamental freedom. Do you get it? Do you get it? African countries, African governments. It's quite unfortunate. Mr. Kanu was, however, adopted, kept in solitary confinement, tortured and denied food and medications, a breach of basic rights. He was chained, humiliated, ridiculed, and held in contempt, and later forcefully removed from Kenya without following the law in violation of his right and fundamental freedom, for which the government of Kenya is liable. Based on the above conclusions, the court makes the following declaration and orders it considers appropriate. A declaration is hereby issued that the abduction of Mr. Nnamdi Kanu, Kanu, holding him in incommunicado confinement, torturing him, and denying him food, water, medication, and other basic incentives was a violation of his rights and fundamental freedom. A declaration is hereby issued that the abduction and subsequent forcible removal of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu, Kanu from Kenya to Nigeria was a violation of the laws of Kenya, his right and fundamental freedom, including freedom of movement and security of the person guaranteed by the Constitution of Kenya 2010, and therefore unconstitutional and illegal. QED. What else do we need to hear? What further inquiry do we need to make? It is as clear as crystal. In fact, it is a shame against the Nigerian government. It is an indictment. In fact, they have compounded the problem to the point that, in fact, the international communities will not regard Nigeria as a country that has regards to human rights. Honestly, it's an indictment. It's a big blow. It's a big blow to the Nigerian government. Big blow, and that is quite interesting, honestly. They couldn't have escaped this. There is no way it is possible for Kenyan authority, for the Kenyan government to exonerate themselves. It is very clear. The ruling is very clear. That is justice. Whether you claim ignorance of his adoption and subsequent rendition, torture, and the rest of them, you are culpable, you are liable. The Constitution provides his security while within the Kenyan territory. So a negligence or gross violation of those rights and fundamental freedoms and rights to protection should not be justified. There is no basis for which the Kenyan government should have been exonerated. The president then should be liable to, if not firing squad, because of the money involved. Otherwise, how could such happen? And you claim ignorance in your own airport. He was intercepted at the airport and you are not aware the security operatives are not there. Wow, what a world. What an Africa. Well, justice has been served, and that will send a direct signal to Justice James Omotoso, who is presiding over Mazi Nnamdi Kanu case. You see, in fact, that is judgment upheld. So Justice James Omotoso has no any other reason to continue the trial. Of course, that is not the first time. The Nigerian government already on 13th of October 2023 declared Mazi Nnamdi Kanu innocent, acquitted and discharged. Yes, about 2 years ago. Now, the Kenya own is being determined 2 years later to affirm the innocency of the leader of the indigenous people of Biafra. So what else? Mazi Nnamdi Kanu defeated Nigerian government in Nigeria despite the illegality, the unlawful and unconstitutional rendition and gross violation of his fundamental rights. The Nigerian government, with brazen impunity, subjected him to rigorous litigations. Why they don't have the jurisdiction? They have committed a breach of his fundamental right and do not observe the protocol for rendition, extradition. It is quite unfortunate. It's quite unfortunate. So the Kenyan judgment is not just new to anyone who has been following this. We know it will definitely happen, no matter what. You can't defend the indefensible. It is practically impossible to defend the indefensible. That is just the case. You cannot defend the indefensible. No matter how much time you buy, you prolong the matter, justice cannot be buried, cannot be covered up. That should be a serious warning to the Nigerian government and Tinubu's administration. Already, Mazi Nnamdi Kanu has been found innocent by the Nigerian Court of Law, highest appellate court of law, the appeal court. Mazi Nnamdi Kanu won in the lower courts, the high courts, and the appeal court, which is the highest appellate court of law. Even the Supreme Court also upheld his innocency, that he never jumped bail, that it was an attempt on his life, and slammed the Nigerian government for gross violation of his rights and fundamental rights of freedom. Well, this is happening, and that shouldn't be a surprise. It is an affirmation that justice must certainly prevail. It doesn't matter how many people are involved that gang up against justice in wickedness. You will not prevail. No matter how the truth is buried, is synced, it will certainly resurface. It will certainly be assumed, and that is where we are today. Congratulations to Mazi Nnamdi Kanu and every lover of freedom. And of course, those who believe in a cause of justice, equity, and fairness. How much could be enough to compensate a man who was tortured brutally without any cause, without any justification. A man subjected, denied food, medications. He was bleeding through his nose and he was blindfolded. You see, taken down to Nigeria and also subjected to illegal trial. Yet the courts, the appellate court of law, upheld his innocency, discharged and acquitted him, and fined Nigeria and demanded that Nigeria must compensate for this gross violation of his rights and fundamental freedoms. Yet, someone who calls himself a human being could jettison the court's order and begin another trial. Under what circumstances? Under what premise? That Mazi Nnamdi Kanu asked the question, tell me, show me that judicial precedent that a man discharged and acquitted by an appellate court of law should be subjected to further trial. What is the judicial precedence? Where has that happened in the history of humanity? That a man declared free, innocent, by an appellate court of law should be subjected to further trial, to endless trial. Mazi Nnamdi Kanu challenged the Nigerian legal system that they should establish any judicial precedence that affirms such actions, that validates such actions anywhere in the world where an accused was discharged and acquitted and yet subjected to endless trial. That is to tell you the level of impunity that is thriving within the Nigerian legal system and political space. Well, today, justice has been served and it has been boldly written that Kenya and Nigeria are liable and culpable of this conspiracy. Congratulations to the Kenyan judicial system that have done what is needful. And going from here, we anticipate, despite the continued trial of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu, that in no distant time, possibly in about a month today, the case will be determined and the innocency of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu will be reaffirmed. Not that it has not been upheld before, will be reaffirmed in Nigeria. And then we will know whether such could be ignored or politicized again. Let's have your own take regarding this development. It's a welcome development and victory for the Biafrans, the indigenous people of Biafra, and humanity in general. Thanks for watching.